as fast, and the city ghettos, you know, it's any vulnerable group, when it has to live in large places like cities, tends to live together to support themselves, to help, you know, as protection, and they used to live in city ghettos. And so we discover that following this period, 1965 was a phase of very great violence in the United States. And there was the rise of the civil rights movement, which was very civil and non-violent on the part of the Afro-American for a very long period, started showing strains of violence. And there was militancy, and then we see that the scenes of burning buildings, troops, tanks were also, were also televised, and worse disturbances took place in Newark, in Detroit, and there was violent and also killing. And so we discover that there was a tiredness among the Afro-American youth against peaceful means, against moderate leadership. And so for a period of time, there was black militancy. They started talking about, black power. And they were angry. They were really angry with the slow pace of change.
And here I would like to add that during this time you have Malcolm X.
Malcolm X.
Who comes up, and there was this...
he was also assassinated.
He was also assassinated, but he was again joining in and pitching in the protest. So we will come to that when we talk of the literature component.
There's just so much, rage which the young people felt at that time, and what Dr. Pandey talks about is the representation of that among the young. And so, President Kennedy made a lot of effort and to improve. The administration started appointing them on high places, and he even appointed his brother as the Attorney General with the idea to address the problem of black voting rights in the South. And we also know that he was also assassinated. It was a violent end. President Johnson, again, now when Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, Lyndon Johnson stepped in. He was vice president. And now for the first time we discover that in recent times, he was from Texas. So there was a South person at the helm of affairs. He made his efforts. Voting Rights Act was passed, and the first black Supreme Court justice was Justice Marshall. Justice Marshall was appointed, and changes in Medicare and education were also attempted. I'll go quickly to see that President Nixon follows, making his own efforts, extending the area, the ambit of the laws that had been made, and supporting open busing. What is busing? Again, desegregation of buses. And they also tried to use negative measures. If people were not doing a certain thing, then grants would be refused to them. So that was another way to force the pace of desegregation. 1988, President Reagan also passes the Civil Rights Restoration Act. And there was this commission which recommended sweeping program for additional jobs, education, housing, and income supplementation. So the civil rights movement that King began was the culmination of a revolution. Now, it is not that the effort to give space to the Afro-American was started by King. No, it was not. It was started by countless people who had been protesting for centuries against inequality. But it was a strange force of the combination of many factors which make up history, that he became the leader in the period of the 60s. He was the product of centuries of agitation by thousands upon thousands of courageous men and women. So this was an overview, a bird's eye view really, of the civil rights movement, which caught the imagination of America in the period between the late 50s and 70s. Thank you for your attention.
So you have a quick survey and view of how the civil rights movement begins and where it goes. And while I was talking about Malcolm X, there's a beautiful film by Spike Lee on Malcolm X, which you might like to see, and you can access through our library, and we'd be able to show it to you, which tells you about a different kind. There was this movement by Martin Luther King, which was actually non-violent movement because he was very deeply influenced by Mahatma Gandhi. You do know that. And on the other side, as Dr. Jayal said, that there was this a section of the youth and the young people who were really protesting because they thought that it would not come this way, that violence was needed. And you can understand this in terms of what happens in situations in India. You do find that when you have people who are, if the Anna Hazare movement, he wanted it to be calm and quiet and let's take the non-violent way. The young are so, spiked up and joshed up. They'd say, we want to take it further and we should do this and that, and it's not going to hit this way. So this was a kind of a backdrop, a kind of a quick survey of the civil rights movement. But to be able to understand the complete impact of the civil rights movement, we also need to have a look at where slavery began, what happened, what kind of life did the blacks have, and how were they discriminated, and what was happening. And for that, I'm going to be inviting Smita Verma to be making her presentation. Is there a question you have in this section?
I'm not in favor of that. When a white person takes pride in calling herself or himself as white, then why not black?
There's a lot of questions together. It's a very loaded question. Please sit. Let's see if I can answer some of it. I'm so glad that you feel that black is not a derogatory term. I'm glad. But nonetheless, let us look at the people who were discriminated on the basis of color. Let us try to go deep into their psychology and how they must have felt at being discriminated on the basis of the skin color. And the whole notion of black power in the 70s was a restatement of that anguish. And the way to address it as a point of strength, recognize us for what we are, and kind of reversing the discrimination and utilizing it as a kind of a positive and in a more assertive manner.
It's all very good to say that the civil rights movement has come this way, but you do all realize that when President Obama was getting elected, what an uphill task it was, simply because he was a black man in a country which has, prides itself on human rights, civil rights. There still was this resistance. And Obama still got elected against all odds. And if any of you have seen those images of his swearing in and the images of the victory and the celebration by the blacks, and that old woman who was part of the civil rights movement, who spoke on television and said that I'd never ever imagined that I would see this day. So, let's go back and there'll be a better understanding of why they were discriminated, why the word was derogatory. When we look at the slave trade, the movement of the slave trade and how the blacks came in as slaves from Africa, if you have an understanding of that, you'll understand that why the word black went in deeper, and they had, why it had such a derogatory and negative connotation for them. And for example, if you are let me give you another example. Supposing you are in England or you are abroad, And if somebody looks at you with a brown skin, and looks at you because you're brown, you do feel it, don't you? Let me give you another example. In our society, why is a fairer girl more beautiful than a dark girl? She may have the best features. Well, then you come to the point. It's a mindset. It's a colonial mindset. And so this entire thing of the white Anglo-Saxon male being at the center of it all, it doesn't go away, does it? No, agreed that today they want to have a tanned skin and they'd love to wear black gowns, which they've been wearing for years. And they've been wearing it in England for years. Even, let me tell you this, there were never slaves in England. Do you know that? England never had a single slave. They were part of the slave trade. But they did not have slaves in their homes working. Not the way that it happened in America. So,
I think I'll add one point.
Yes, Anupma.
That it's more related to the job opportunities which were there at that time for the blacks. They were the consumers, but they were not given the rights, for the sellers, for being the sellers. So that kind of divide in the employment opportunity led to them joining so many unions prevalent at that time, like CIO and AFL. These organizations were there because of that kind of argument and demands from the blacks. So it's not related to what kind of dress you are wearing, but it's related to what kind of job opportunities you have. Economic reasons were more prevalent at that time.
Money is power. You do understand that if a better status, if you have more money, if you have more opportunity to earn money, then you are able to make a powerful case for yourself in society. Yes, we have another question.
Ma'am, what were the Browns doing? Actually, the child who is born out of a black mother and a white father, the mother who is a slave. So, what was their position? If women did not have any rights then, and men had all the rights, then at least the children could have got the rights of.
Can I say something like this? I remember reading about this, that it's very painful. Please simply sit. I may not have tried to answer this question. Very often, an African American woman would be slave in a rich white household. All of you have seen Gone with the Wind. To carry that further, very often to have more slaves, to propagate more labor, because labor trade was legally stopped at a particular point of time. But you still needed working hands, you still needed chattels. So very often there were children born out of wedlock to these women, slave women in rich white households, to have labor available. And the women had practically no right on the child. They had no right on the child because they were like the modern surrogate mothers. It's very, so they were just creating the child for someone else. So the word that I use, surrogacy, is to contextualize it for understanding. It is not a kind of a technical, it's not to be used.
These children were called mulattoes, right? And it's not that the women didn't suffer. Let me tell you this, that when not all children were born with the consent. Normally if the man of the house, the white man of the house decided to be involved or would be taking the black maid and the mulatto child. But sometimes, in many novels and stories, you have this, that the lady of the house was very nice to the black maid till such time that she produces this mulatto child and she realizes that her husband has been in a relationship. So listen, the marginalization was immense, the suffering was immense. It was not this very calculated thing that kept happening, that it was a calculated thing. But this was also one reason.
Sit here.
What Dr. Jayal said was one more reason for having children is that, you generate more labor. color has mattered all through. Let me tell you, dear students, color matters even today. And let's say that despite civil rights movement, despite a black president in America, you have heard of what resistance he has within his country. You've heard of the groups that have all come up. You've heard about these groups which resist and oppose him. So it's never been easy. It's not going to be easy. And if you talk of color, that's a mindset that is there amongst us Indians. It's stronger there. And it is rooted in the history of the slaves and their lives, which Smita would be touching upon. You have a question?
Actually, I want to say, like in the present scenario, in India, if you take in the Indian context, with the Indian Hindu family especially, like ST and SCs, if there's a girl who is brighter, not in color, but still she is denied. And what I'm trying to convey this message, the linking, that the American people, the American African people, who were earlier given the job of derogatory, sort of, a very low job, and which made them,
I get your point. The discrimination has been on the basis of class, color, caste, gender, whatever. So the discrimination occurs at all those levels. So if you talk of class, economics, yeah, I think Smita, you should take over.
Because see, even now we talk of gender equality, right? And we fully agree with it that both men and women are equal. But in practice, does it happen? Still, we are struggling with so many issues, So theoretically, even in America today, the America that we have today, there are many issues which have to be handled. Even now, there's a fight for, to end discrimination against sexism, racism, that still goes on. So the color issue that you are trying to relate is with the caste, with the Indian system had. But if you get back to it, in the Indian system, it was basically the Varn Vyavastha. It spoke of on the basis of the color was not hereditary. Okay, it was supposed to be deciding your occupation. And the occupation was, the mobility was up and down the ladder. But when it changed into caste system, then it became derogatory because there was no mobility. But over here, when we are talking of the blacks and whites, the mobility factor didn't come at all because it was a race which was being targeted. It was a race which was, and it is not that they came to America quite late. North America was touched in 1690. Before that, they were already there in Brazil and most of the Latin and South American countries. And the Dutch and the Spanish and all, they took them there. Right? So I think that's one issue which is still debatable on what basis the discrimination has been made. It will be interesting if we can just get back before the civil rights movement and see how the life of the African American slave was actually, and what were the reasons, what were the kind of life they were living. It started, like I told you, that it started in 1619. Maybe we can just these handouts, and you can just have a chronological view of how it started. Right. And that was the first ship that came to North America and Virginia was carrying 20 African slaves, and it came on a Dutch ship. Okay, and it came to the town of Jamestown. That is when slavery began. However, during that time, till it was legalized, legally permitted, there was institutionalized, slaves were kind of, servants, indentured servants. It is only after it became legalized that the slaves and their lives was very torturous and tumultuous. Now let's have a look at this. We'll have a brief overview of the nature of slave
Look at that, use this
family.
later.
Now,
I think you can just keep the handouts with you and use it later for reference. At this moment, I think you need to listen to what she's saying.
Okay, can we go further?
Yes. Yeah.
So we talk of the African American community and culture, right? And there are many things when we talk of jazz, we talk of hip hop and so many other things. We talk of them as being African American culture. Now let's see how this culture evolved actually, not just the culture but also the community. In this development, the most important institution which played a role was the institution of family. Slave trade was responsible for the breakup of the African family. Because the wives, the husbands, the children, all were liable to be sold separately because the US law did not recognize their family. And so they were not even permitted to get married legally in any of the American colonies, be it North or South. Okay? So which meant that why was this? Because the law considered them to be a commodity, a property. And if you're a property, a chattel, you don't have any right to yourself. The person who owns you can buy or sell or do anything with you. Okay, that was one reason. Now, which meant that if they cannot enter into marriage, they could not have a family, they could not stay together, they could not have children. So that was the fragility of the family setup that they had. Now, despite this fragility of the family bonds, the slave, they created family structures, marriage practices and customs, naming practices, and also a kind of kinship system unappreciated.
I don't know whether the kids
Okay?
are.
And you can see this family over here. The extended system of kinship, which was central to the African community,
Very interesting.
it found its newfound purpose in the system of American slavery.
You won't,
And what
because
was
of
it?
one's interest, one
It was
won't like to
effective
go so
kinship
deep
which was
in
used by the
something, but then
slaves
you can
to
hear it.
humanize the world